Good morning. Thank you for joining us early morning after a long Thanksgiving weekend. Seems to be cruel and unusual punishment, but we have a very big program to get underway and wanted to get started. I'm Martin Indyk. I'm the Executive Vice President of the Brookings Institution. We are delighted to have the opportunity to host this very special gathering, the International Symposium on Housing, Inclusion and Social Equity. The subject itself is an urgent and compelling one. The relationship in particular between place, race and lack of opportunity has been driven home to us here in the United States by the dramatic highlighting of those inequalities in places like Baltimore and Ferguson. And it is for that reason that Brookings itself has taken a very important initiative to focus our intellectual resources across three of our programs: our Metropolitan Program, our Economic Studies Program, and our Governance Studies Program, to bring together our scholars to work on this bundle of issues which have defied effective solutions now for more than 5 decades. We know what the problems are. We don't seem to be able to come up with effective solutions. And that is why we're particularly happy to have the opportunity to host this international symposium, because there is much that I think we can learn from experiences not only around the United States, but internationally as well. And for that reason, we're particularly pleased this morning to welcome the Deputy Prime Minister of Singapore, Tharman Shanmugaratnam, who as the person responsible in the Singapore government for housing policy, has a particularly important set of insights on these challenges. I'm also very happy that we're able to have this symposium as a partnership with 2 other American institutions that have great importance and roles in these areas. I'm speaking in particular of Washington University and St. Louis. Brookings and Washington University have a close partnership that stems from the fact that the founder of Brookings, Mr. Brookings himself, also played a critical role in the development of WashU in St. Louis. And we're also very pleased to be partnering with Duke University in the form of Sandy Darity and the Samuel Du Bois Cook Center on Social Equity at Duke University. Our own contributions today and in the ongoing research comes from Richard Reeves and Belle Sawhill and the Brookings Center on Children and Family. And so we have this dynamic partnership between 2 great universities, the Singapore government and Brookings itself. And so on behalf of Brookings, I'm very happy to have the opportunity to welcome you all here today and online, and I wish you the very best with your deliberations on a very urgent and critical issue. Thank you. I was supposed to introduce David Rubenstein, who wears 2 hats this morning. He is the co-chair of the Brookings Institution, but he is also the chairman of Duke University. And so in both capacities, we thought it was very appropriate for David Rubenstein to welcome you this morning. David, please.
Thank you very much, Martin. The third hat is actually In my private business operations, I have a very close relationship with Singapore, and I've spent a lot of time in Singapore, and the government of Singapore has been very close to my firm through its investment arm. So I wear 3 hats: Duke, Brookings, and a great lover and a fan of Singapore. For most of organized history, the concept of equality did not exist. You can say that Homo sapiens are on the face of the earth for roughly 200,000 years. The idea that they were going to be all treated equal didn't really exist for most of that time. In fact, if organized history is roughly 10,000 years old, you could argue, in the East and the West, it was really only about 100, maybe 200 years ago that the idea that people should be treated equally came about. And it came about in something that Thomas Jefferson wrote. In the Declaration of Independence, he said, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." Now, of course, when he wrote that, he had 2 slaves with him. He owned about 100 slaves, so how could he have written that? Well, he meant it in a sense that people were created equal, but he didn't think they could live together. But those words became the inspiration for many people in this country and around the world, the idea that people could be equal. One person who thought that they really should be equal was Abraham Lincoln. And ultimately, when the Civil War arose, because we didn't really have equality because we had slavery until the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln did something about that. But even after the Civil War, and with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, we didn't really have equality because of the Jim Crow laws. And even after the Civil Rights Revolution of the 1960s, we really didn't have real equality. The laws changed a bit, but we still didn't have real equality. We've made a lot of progress in racial equality, religious equality, gender equality, but we still are not where we should be. Housing equality really is something that has to be given a lot of attention now, because it's clear from all kinds of studies that if people don't grow up in housing that is appropriate for them, they have a chance, very limited chance of growing up to be citizens who can rise up through our system. Social mobility is very modest if you grow up in housing that is inadequate. Studies repeatedly show that income is measured to a large extent by where you grew up. And if you grow up in housing that's inappropriate, your chance of rising is very, very modest. And so today, we have an opportunity to discuss how we can do things in our society to make it possible for all humans, all people, not just in the United States, but all around the world, to grow up in a society where they have housing that is appropriate to live in, appropriate to foster education, appropriate to foster conducive conduct between other human beings. If we don't do that, we're going to be condemned in this country and all other countries around the world to a life where certain people are not going to be having a chance to be equal. And what the concept of equality is one of the most important concepts that I think has ever existed on the face of the earth. The idea that all people have a chance to be equal, and they should be given their potential to do that. Now, today at this conference, we have a chance to talk about that. We're not going to solve housing inequality at this conference, but we can make a start in bringing to the fore some of the issues that have really been raised by many scholars in recent years when they have noted that people who grow up in housing that is inappropriate do not have a chance to rise up and do not have a chance to fulfill their potential and do not have a chance to really be equal to other citizens who grew up in better housing. So hopefully this conference and other things that can follow from it can live up to the idea that we can make our country one that truly is equal, not just in racial equality or gender equality or religious equality, but also in housing equality. And that is a very important thing that I hope we can get out of this conference. So thank you very much for including Duke in this. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Jim Wirch. I'm Vice Chancellor for International Affairs at Washington University in St. Louis, and I'm delighted to be here for a couple of major reasons having to do both with the Brookings Institution and with international studies with places like Singapore. As Martin Indyk noted, Washington University has a long history with the Brookings Institution. Brookings Hall was named as such on the Washington University campus in 1928. Robert S. Brookings was here helping found the Brookings Institution in 1916. And so this relationship has gone on for some time, and it's one reason that we're delighted to be part of this meeting today. The other is Washington University has created a new kind of major initiative on globalizing our university through an organization we call the McDonnell International Scholars Academy, which was founded 10 years ago. This is an academy in the sense that it brings in people from partner universities and does relationship building and collaborative research with them. We have 28 partner universities, including the National University of Singapore, which was one of our founding partners in the McDonnell Academy. We recruit scholars from there, but we also do collaborative research. And today we're seeing one of the outcomes of having National University of Singapore as a founding partner in the McDonnell Academy. Michael Schradden, Professor Michael Schradden, my colleague from Washington University, is the ambassador, we call the ambassador to NUS. And he's helped build relationships there for many years, actually. But now we're starting to do this more in the area of the Next Stage Institute, which is an initiative that's between Michael Schradden at Washington University and NUS. And we look at being able to deal with the kind of large-scale issues that David Rubenstein just mentioned as something that needs to be done on a global level. And hence our partners around the world become very important in this respect. And today's an example of that, how we can look at housing equity as an issue that exists not only in the United States, certainly does here, but the role model that we can find in places like Singapore and the ways that we can come together with better solutions maybe for places everywhere. So thank you very much for having Washington University as part of this. We're delighted to be here, and I look forward to some of the ideas we come up with today. Thank you.
Good morning. I'd like to say thank you to David Rubenstein for his profound observations about the history of human attitudes and beliefs about inequality, and for representing Duke University. And also like to thank Richard Reeves for his enthusiastic response when Michael Schradden and I approached him about the possibility of holding this convening at Brookings. And I also would like to extend an additional thanks to Zhu Li at Washington University and Winwright at Duke for all their support and help in making this conference come together. The genesis of the conference took place in the context of the strategic planning process for our new Samuel Du Bois Cook Center on Social Equity. Michael Schradden generously agreed to participate in that process. And while he was in Durham, we had a conversation about the Deputy Prime Minister of Singapore, Tharman Shanmugaratnam, giving a series of speeches about Singapore's success in eliminating residential and social segregation. And so the question became whether or not the strategies that had been pursued in Singapore could be applicable elsewhere. Was there a possibility of translating the policies that have been pursued in Singapore to countries that exist on a much larger scale with a very different political culture? And that was the basis for us putting this conference together. And we're very pleased at the Deputy Prime Minister's willingness to give the keynote address here. The theme of this conference is deeply simpatico with the mission of our new center at Duke. The Samuel Du Bois Cook Center on Social Equity is focused on the problem of inequality, and it is Duke's major initiative to try to address the problems of inequity and unfairness in the world, as well as, of course, in the United States and our home state of North Carolina. I'd like to mention briefly one of our major projects that is now underway. It is the Ford Foundation-funded National Asset Scorecard on Communities of Color. The Ford Foundation has provided support for this with Derek Hamilton at the New School and myself serving as the principal investigators on the grant. The grant involves the surveying of finely defined ethnic groups in various metropolitan centers in the United States to try to capture substantial information about their net worth position. We have surveyed 5 cities thus far, and we're now in the process of generating a set of reports. Those cities are Miami, Los Angeles, Boston, Washington, D.C., and Tulsa, Oklahoma. And one of the aspects of this study is a focus on housing and neighborhood quality issues. That's central to our major projects. And I must mention, particularly since Martin Indyk started the conference with this observation, that the next city that we're going to survey is Baltimore, Maryland. Finally, I'd like to take the time to thank Michael Sheridan for his enthusiasm about this project as well, and for his thoughtfulness about how we might put together a convening that could address these serious issues. His work on asset development for those who are poor has been a signal body of research that has reshaped the way in which we think about the prospects of altering the wealth distribution in our society. I particularly want to make note of the experiment that's been conducted in the state of Oklahoma, the SEEDS project, which provides an opportunity for the development of child trust funds for young people in that state. There's actually some very, very interesting issues that project has raised that we have to think about, but it's a very, very important step in trying to change the conditions of opportunity for young people in the United States. I think, in my opinion, that's one of Michael's central contributions, but he's made many, many more as leader and director of Washington University's Center on Social Development. And we will hear from him next.
Thank you very much for being here. I'm Michael Sheridan, and I appreciate all the comments. Thanks, Sandy, for a positive word about our center. I also want to say thanks to Brookings Institution. I think Brookings Institution was officially part of Washington University originally a long time ago. So some of us have not quite let go of that. So we do feel a strong kinship to this institution, and currently renewing that relationship. And Jim's very active in that, and we look forward to that partnership going forward. Sandy has also been and Duke have been terrifically great partners in this work. Sandy was the first person I called, when we were able to put this conference together. He's just started a new center on social equity, the Samuel Du Bois Cook Center, which is going to be doing really excellent work going forward, and we look forward to that partnership in the United States and beyond. NUS is also a partner institution here, and so it's not just the government that's represented here, but also the academic institution. And I think you will see by some of the speakers from NUS that there's not everybody is of a single mind about these policies. And actually, one of the benefits of this conference today is that there will be some give and take, and people have different views and raise different aspects of issues. And I think that's what will make this day particularly productive. I would say this is a perspective very much from the United States, that if we don't figure out housing and race, residence and race, our prospects don't look that good. We are a country that is going to be minority European descent and majority people of color in the not too distant future, and to have sharply segregated residential segregation, which leads to and also segregation by class. So sharply divided or intensive neighborhoods full of poverty leads to very poor outcomes in general for the children that we want to raise for the next generation. So this is not a viable strategy for the United States, and in my view, we're not really even talking about it in the terms that might set the stage for solving this problem. So, as mentioned, I also have a professorship in Singapore, and you will hear that Singapore has a very different strategy about housing policy. So I think the goal here is to can we put some different perspectives on the table and consider how we can learn from each other. I would say a word about Singapore briefly. Singapore is a very innovative little country. It doesn't regularly engage in policy discussions internationally, at least in social issues, maybe more so in economic issues under the current Deputy Prime Minister, who's very active internationally. But Mr. Tharman has begun to speak a little bit about social policy, as mentioned, and so I asked him. We were both in Singapore at the same meeting in July, and he agreed to come and speak if he could work it out. He's a very busy guy, and he's in town, I think, for a committee with the International Monetary Fund, a policy committee. So we're able to work out this conference. So we're grateful to the Deputy Prime Minister for making time for this meeting. But Singapore is very, very innovative and very creative about social policy. I would think of it mostly. I've been studying and working in Singapore for 25 years, I guess. Very, very innovative strategies, very different, very distinctive, that may not apply to other places or may, but these are examples that should be considered in international policy discussions. And you'll hear more about that going forward. Turning to our really excellent speaker today, the Deputy Prime Minister, Tharman Shanmugaratnam, has been Deputy Prime Minister since 2011. He is also the chairman of the Central Bank, the Monetary Fund of Singapore. Before that, before entering politics, he was the managing director of the central bank, so has a lot of international central banking experience. He's also the chair of the Monetary and Financial Committee of the International Monetary and Financial Committee, which is a policy committee of the International Monetary Fund. He has been the finance minister for a number of years. He has been the education minister. I had the privilege of introducing him in Singapore, I think in 2007, when he was education minister and I think second finance minister. So he's done an awful lot since that time. He also now holds a new position in Singapore as coordinating minister for economic and social policy, and I'm not quite sure what that means, but it's a very Singaporean kind of way to think that you would put economic and social policy together. And I just want to, as one final point, emphasize this, that in the West, in much of the West, we think about social policy as a kind of residual, that the economy generates resources, and then with those extra resources, you can do some social policy. That's pretty much the underlying assumption. In Singapore, the assumption really is that you have to develop the people and the society and the economy together, and it's a very conscious strategy, quite different from the way that we usually think. So I hope that sets the context for what the Deputy Prime Minister will offer, and so I turn it over to Mr. Tharman.
Well, if anyone thought multiculturalism doesn't have a chance, they should have heard how everyone starting from Martin Indyk pronounced Shanmugaratnam perfectly. I mean, perfectly. That's something. But thank you very much for inviting me. I think we've had a very thoughtful set of opening remarks. And I'd like to thank especially Sandy Darity and Michael Sheridan and Richard Reeves for actually pulling us all together, thinking through the panels, thinking through the speakers, and I'm very happy to be here. We're really talking about something that's the defining challenge of our times around the world. It's not just an advanced country issue, although we know what's happening in France and the United States and elsewhere. It's also across the whole range of developing countries. We've got serious problems, serious challenges that have to do with social inclusion and social mobility everywhere. In the advanced countries, they went through a burst of mobility after the war, very unusual circumstances, an economic catch-up as well as a social catch-up. The developing countries, some have succeeded in unleashing a wave of social mobility, but most haven't. So it remains a challenge that's not just been with us for some time, but unfortunately, in many ways, is getting tougher and more important. And in Singapore too, we have this challenge. We've always thought of it in terms of economic and social policies intertwined. We never had the luxury of thinking of them as separate arenas for policy. And even today, we think of it not just because we appoint a minister in charge of it, we think of it as one and the same. Our challenges are very hard to disentangle and identify as economic or social. We have challenges like everyone else of income inequality, we're a market economy and extremely exposed to the world, to global economic forces. We are seeing gradually a slowdown in social mobility as has happened in all the mature societies. And we know that keeping a multicultural society together, not just in name, not just in form, but in spirit, is continuous work. It's continuous work. And that project goes back to the time we started off as a nation, time of our birth, because we were an unusual country, multiracial from outset, and multiracial as a project. That's why we became independent. We are also very diverse with regard to religion. There was a Pew survey or Pew study last year that had Singapore as the most diverse country in the world when it comes to religion. So we have to contend with these facts as reality, but we also have the opportunity of transforming these circumstances into something that's a virtue, something that people take pride in, something that gives us strength, something that makes us distinctive. I'll go through a set of slides very quickly, just to set out some interesting facts about Singapore and how we compare with some other countries. Let me try and manage this. So this was takes off from what Raj Chetty presented at Brookings earlier this year. He had pulled together a number of studies. If you just ignore Singapore for a moment, because that comes from our own estimates at the Ministry of Finance, the rest is Raj Chetty's work, pulling together the best international studies, best studies in each country, common methodology wherever possible. And this summarizes a whole range of indicators on mobility. This measure captures the proportion of people who start off in the bottom ranks of society and who start off with their parents being in the bottom ranks of society, but they as children end up by the time they're in their late 20s and early 30s in the upper bracket, defined as income in this instance. And, it's not an unfamiliar picture. In the United States, 7.5% of those in the bottom 20% end up in the top 20%. Denmark is well known as a European example where there's still a fair bit of mobility. About 12% of them make it up to the top. Canada, although it's just beside the United States, is quite a different society. And then Singapore, partly because we are a younger society and partly because we put a lot of effort into it, we're still achieving a fair degree of mobility. And this is the latest cohort that's late 20s, early 30s. But we'll face the same challenges as every mature society. It gets harder over time, even in a meritocratic system. It gets harder over time because the advantages that come to children or parents with education, with income, and with a whole range of social know-how as to how to make your kids succeed. Those advantages don't diminish over time. They have tended to grow. So we face the same challenges. That's the first slide. Second slide, very quickly, we've managed to get relatively even income growth across the spectrum of our society. Not always. In fact, a decade ago, we had significant stagnation of those at the bottom. And we've done some things about it. I'm sorry, I have to press the... Okay, that's real mobility. So we've done something about it. We've put effort both through EITC-type schemes, tax credits if you work, as well as a whole range of other measures to maximize the potential of everyone, even if you start off without too much education and you're doing a relatively simple job. But this is continuous work, achieving an even spread of incomes, and in particular, avoiding a growing gulf between the average in your society and those in the bottom ranks, income-wise. So we have done better than most, but it's continuous work. Next, now this is a very interesting slide, and I'm not going to go through the technicalities, but it is in a sense the educational version of the typical mobility indices that we look at. Now this comes out of the OECD PISA study, and we know the basic results of the PISA study, who's on top, Singapore, Korea, Shanghai, and so on, mathematics, science, and even things like problem solving, which are not things that you prepare for by rote. But this is a different indicator. This looks at the percentage of those who are socially disadvantaged, who actually perform at the top end. And this is by age 14 or so, early high school years. Percentage of those who come from a disadvantaged background, who perform at the top end. And that's a very important figure, because education is still our most important instrument for achieving social mobility. The proportion of those in the bottom 25%, to be precise, who make it into the top 25% of OECD performance, adjusted for socioeconomic background, in Singapore is quite high. It's 15% out of 25%, more than half. So that's an important measure of mobility, but as I'll speak briefly about later, it's a whole set of, it's about institutions, it's about people, especially head teachers and teachers, and it's about a culture within education. Next, home ownership, which I'm going to dwell on a bit later. Now, this is just something fairly well known. In fact, these countries are not countries with low home ownership by the standards of most advanced countries. The United States, for instance, is relatively high home ownership. But this has been central to Singapore's strategy. Home ownership across the whole spectrum of society, including, as I'll mention briefly later, including for those who would ordinarily be thought of as too poor to afford a home. And this slide is one of the most interesting slides in the light of everything we observe in the world around today. I didn't choose the United States because I'm trying to pick on American cities. It's just that the US is one of the few countries that publishes this data, on residential distribution by ethnicity in every city, in every metropolitan area, and by neighborhoods within metropolitan areas. And what this looks at is, within a metropolitan area, which has many neighborhoods, how segregated are the neighborhoods? How segregated are they as far as ethnicity is concerned? So the closer you are to 100, the more segregated it is. And the closer you are to 0, the more evenly distributed it is, in line with the average for the whole metropolitan area. No surprises as to the cities that are on the top in the United States, Detroit. If you're interested in the figure for Ferguson or St. Louis, which includes Ferguson, that's about 71, which is close to the top. Baltimore, 64. So well above average in terms of the extent of segregation by race across neighborhoods. Singapore, as I'll come to later, this has been a matter of public policy, avoiding racial segregation. It's never perfect, because you'll never get an even distribution of ethnicity in every neighborhood. There's individual choice, there's family choice, but we've tried to constrain those choices so as to minimize the extent to which one neighborhood is different from another because of ethnicity. And it's a central plank of our social policy. Next, and I'll explain later how we get to this point. As a result of our policies, in our neighborhoods, we've been able to achieve a roughly even appreciation in home prices and home equity across the whole spectrum of homeowners. And that includes low-income homeowners, which is the first bar, which is really, it's principally low-income, those who own what we call three-room housing development board flats, the smaller flats. In fact, they've done a little better over the course of this 35 years. This is 1980 to 2015. So 35 years, they've done a little better. But the essential point is the lower income group has not been left out in the accumulation of wealth through home ownership, has not been left out in the accumulation of home equity. And that's, again, central to our strategy. That's the economic benefit of the social strategy that we've adopted. This is a public housing neighborhood. Flats of different, apartments of different sizes, close proximity to each other, but critically, sharing quality public spaces, social ownership of public spaces, shared ownership, close proximity to everyone, doesn't belong to one block or another, or one class of apartment owners or another. This is 2012, relatively new, but even if you go to older states like my own, those in my own constituency, you see the same. And every time I get a serious foreign visitor coming to Singapore, and I have to have dinner and a chat with them, I don't take them to the tourist attractions, I bring them to my constituency. I walk them through the park that everyone uses on the way home, on the way to work. I take them up to some of my residents' homes so they know what it's like. The type of quality you get in everyday living for an ordinary person, for an ordinary citizen. And I take them finally to dinner to my hawker center in my constituency, where you've got stalls of all sorts, individual proprietors running their small stalls, and everyone eats there. Different ethnic groups, different social groups. That's the secret sauce of Singapore, the neighborhoods. And finally, extremely important, recreation, parks, regardless of your status in life, access to quality parks and waterways not too far from your home. The park connectors are, I guess, High Line in New York is a park connector, green avenues that connect parks together. And this is still work in progress. This is what you see today, but by 2030, it's going to be much more widespread. Today, we've got 8 in 10 households, 8 in 10 Singaporean households have a park within 10 minutes walk, about 400 meters. By 2030, it'll be 9 in 10. Parks, quality spaces for young and old, whether they're serious about their sports or they just want to have a jog or want to be with the grandkids. Quality spaces for everyone, not far from home, regardless of your social status. So that's the slides I wanted to show. And now let me give you a perspective of why we've done what we've done and how we go about it. And I'll spend a little more time on housing policy. But basically, as I say, the secret sauce is our neighborhoods, the composition of the neighborhoods, and the way the neighborhoods are designed so as to maximize interaction and give us the best chance of achieving an integrated society. Give us the best chance. They're designed for that purpose. And it's not just about the numbers, about ratios of ethnic groups in different neighborhoods. It's about the everyday experiences that come about because of your design. It's walking along the corridor every day, taking the same elevators down. It's the way your kids grow up in the playgrounds or in the primary school nearby. It's about the peers in the neighborhood that you either fall for or aspire to be like. It's about both the opportunities and the traps that come from living in a neighborhood where you either have influences that you get sucked into that take you down a path that doesn't lead anywhere, or you have opportunities that come about because you notice someone else and all your friends are rushing to school. they're doing their sports, and you do things together. So neighborhoods matter, the culture of neighborhoods matter, but it doesn't come about by accident. It's got to be planned for, it's got to be designed. And the nice thing about all our societies is that people are actually looking for something positive in their lives. And if you provide that opportunity, if you provide the scope for interaction, positive things tend to happen. The core of it is public housing. And linked to public housing, the schools, the hawker centers, the parks, the common spaces. But public housing is at the core of it. And our policy evolved over the years. It really started out of necessity. We had congested, unsanitary urban living. Slum-like conditions in villages, even in the rural parts of Singapore. They were ethnically concentrated, but it was also a very low standard of living. So it started out of necessity. In the years before we obtained independence, and especially after independence. But what started off as a matter of necessity, just providing a basic standard of living that every citizen deserved, evolved to become an active strategy of achieving social integration through public housing. And what started off as a policy that was aimed principally at those from the lower income group and eventually the middle income group became a policy that catered to the majority of society, from the lowest income to the upper middle income group. And many young couples who eventually end up being in the high income brackets start off in housing development board flats. They start off in public housing. So they too start off and develop that ethos, of that same ethos that everyone has as a result of our public housing strategy. It's not, so it now caters to well over 80% of the population living in what we call public housing. It's not social housing as you know it in many countries. It's high quality apartments developed and planned by the public sector, but it's a private asset. You buy and sell your apartment on the open market. It's a private asset. What's critical is that it's planned with public policy in mind, getting a social mix into every neighborhood and ensuring that the common spaces are socially owned, social ownership of common spaces. So it's privately owned apartments, which people buy knowing that it's an investment asset and a potential retirement asset, but social ownership of the common spaces and a design and rules that give us the best chance of achieving social integration across that broad span of society. So it's not social housing as you typically know it. And what it means is we achieve income integration of social groups that vary in income and integration of different ethnic groups. How do you achieve integration in the same estates of different income groups? First, they're designed such that apartments catering to the different groups are in very close proximity to each other. If I take my own constituency, the lowest income group live in rental blocks, and that's a very small proportion of Singapore's population. 5% of Singapore's population lives in public rental blocks. It's those with the lowest incomes. And I've got several blocks in my constituency that cater to that group. 50 meters away from where they live are the apartment blocks catering to the upper middle income group. What I had on the slide earlier is 5-room flats. 50 meters away. Not even across a road with traffic, but across a service road within the same estate. 50 meters away. Same estate, same parks, same slides and swings. Proximity matters. Second thing we have to do, of course, is make sure it's affordable to the low-income group, because the low-income group in most countries can't afford to own a home as distinct from renting a home. And we do so through the public budget. That's fiscal policy. we do so through the public budget, a grant that's given on a progressive basis to low and middle income individuals based on their income. And it's a very significant grant. To get an entry-level flat, which we call a two-room flat, in Singapore that's the entry level, but it's actually the same. Our low-income group in Singapore, the size of their apartments is about the average for Hong Kong and Tokyo. So they're relatively well provided. Smaller than the other flats in Singapore, but it's a decent standard of living. To buy that small apartment as a low-income person, someone who's in the bottom 20%, you get a public grant that's typically, if I take this year's launches, typically it's about 70% to 75% of the price that you have to pay. It comes from public grant. And the remaining portion of the price, you get a loan from the Housing Development Board, and you pay down the loan over a long period using savings from your social security contributions, which is another Singapore innovation, the ability to use your social security contributions to invest in an asset that can hopefully accumulate over time. So it's affordable because of fiscal policy, because of grants that make it affordable. And that's the income side of it. But how about ethnicity? That required rules. We have only achieved what we have wanted to do because we introduced rules. And this is, till today, the most intrusive social policy that we have in Singapore, but probably also the most important. And particularly in retrospect, and particularly when we look around the world, this is the most important social policy in Singapore. Rules that ensure that you don't get large ethnic concentrations in any particular neighborhood. It didn't start off that way. It started off with us moving people from what were villages and urban conurbations that had significant ethnic complexions to them into the same housing estates. But over time, we found through the resale market, when people sold their flats eventually, that you got greater and greater concentrations of ethnic groups in different neighborhoods. There were some neighborhoods with a significant over-concentration of Chinese, or the majority population. There were some with significant concentrations of Malays, with about 30% of Malays living in a neighborhood, although the national average is 15%. And when it came to applications for flats in those neighborhoods, it became over 50% of applicants being Malay. So we realized that in the late 80s that we had to do something a little more intrusive. We had to put caps on the proportion of people from each ethnicity who would live in a particular neighborhood. Caps for each apartment block, caps for each precinct or enclave within the neighborhood, and caps for the neighborhood as a whole. That's intrusive. It doesn't tell someone where they should go to live. They're free to choose an apartment anywhere in Singapore, but there are caps within the neighborhood. And once you reach that cap, and you're of a particular ethnicity that's hit by that cap, then you look elsewhere for a flat. It's been extremely important. That's what's held our society together. And the everyday interactions, the growing up together, comes about because people are living together in the same estate and not far from each other. So that's income and ethnicity. But how do we make sure that inclusion, social inclusion, is attractive? How do we make sure that people enjoy living there and want to live there? Public spaces are critical. The quality of apartments, of course, is critical, but public spaces are critical. And the public spaces I'm talking about involve the parks that I talked about. It involves eating establishments, and particularly our hawker centers and coffee shops, where a very wide span of our society goes to. In fact, about a third of our population visits hawker centers at least twice a week, if not more often. It involves community clubs in every constituency, where you have a whole range of activities catering to different groups. It involves access to jobs wherever you live, through public transport, and if you're better off and you've got a car, through private transport, car parks, the roads. So public facilities are critical besides ownership of flats. Service standards, a greatly neglected area. Avoiding the broken window is critical in Singapore. Avoiding the broken window. Every resident pays a service and conservancy charge, and they expect good service from the town council that runs their estate. If the lift breaks down, the service standard is it's got to be repaired within 25 minutes. If the power breaks down, which is rare in Singapore, but sometimes you get a major power failure, 75 minutes. If the water supply is disrupted, also very rare, but if it happens, 40 minutes. And now, using technology, you can send your complaints instantly and make sure it gets attention. Snap and send. And we've set up a municipal service office that collates data on problems all over Singapore. Traffic problems, other municipal problems, so that there's a bright light shining on the problems and public officers are accountable for trying to solve them across agencies. So service standards matter. Avoiding the broken window. Third, I spoke about public spaces, I spoke about service standards. A third critical component is rejuvenation of public housing estates. Avoiding the state of disrepair that comes about quite naturally all over the world by rejuvenating it using public funds. We rejuvenate the estate as a whole, improve the parks, the neighborhood, bring in new facilities, new exercise equipment as people get older, a whole range of things that the community wants and provides feedback on. That's paid for by the government, 100%. Significant upgrading, which we call the Neighborhood Renewal Program, once every 20 years or so, a little less than 20 years. But we also upgrade individual apartments, although they were sold and they are a private asset. But as part of the public housing scheme, every 20 years or so, we go through a home improvement program where the government will co-pay the cost of upgrading the home. Typically work on the bathroom, the ceilings, if there's some spalling concrete, changing the doors and the like. Largely paid for by the government, but with some co-payment by the owner of the home. So rejuvenation is extremely important, and rejuvenation across that span of public housing, for the low income to the upper middle income, so that everyone's home and everyone's block is spruced up from time to time, and no one feels that they're living in a part of a neighborhood that's worse than the others. So that's the third component of it. How do you link this to the most important strategy, which is schools? That's an extremely important part of our Singapore story. The nice thing about primary schools all over the world is that they tend to be close to the home. Parents tend to send their kids to primary schools quite close to the home. So once you've got that social mix in the neighborhoods, you also have the social mix in grade 1 and all the way through primary school, in most schools. But it's also critical to ensure an even quality of teaching and the educational experience across the schools. That's critical, and it comes about by us having a public school system. All primary schools are public schools. There are no private schools. And at the secondary school level, or what you call high schools, out of about 170 secondary schools, we have 3 private schools, and they're not at the pinnacle of the system. They're more like safety valves. So it's a public school system, and we can then decide on admission procedures. In primary school, admission based on where you live, but paying some, paying recognition to the old school ties that also exist, father or mother, and to the fact that you've got a sibling in the school. So finding that balance between school ties and proximity to the home so that you do get that social mix. And once you're getting into secondary school and beyond, meritocratic entry based on a range of merits, academic as well as non-academic merits. Continuous work. We still have some schools with significant ethnic concentration. That's continuous work, but it's critical. Not just rules to get the right mix of students, but offering everyone a high quality of education wherever they are on the island. And that means public schools, centralized teacher training and teacher posting, and movement of principals or head teachers around the school system, where no principal stays in the same school for more than 6 or 7 years, by and large. If you're doing a good job, please move on to another school and do the same. If you're not doing a good job, you might need a change of environment. You move to another school and someone else will take over from you here. So that movement of people and movement of good people across the system is what ensures that you don't get this gulf in the middle of the school system. You don't have high peaks and deep valleys. You have a high average level of education in every sense of the term education. And if you look at our primary school leaving examination, we've got a national examination at age 12 to decide on which schools you go into, as one of the criteria for which schools you go into. We've got about 177 primary schools. The top 5% of pupils on this national examination come from 170 of these 177 schools. So they're all around the island, students ending up at the top. And it comes about not just because of their innate abilities, but it's a system. It's good people, good teachers, all around the system. I've covered schools, I've covered parks, I've covered the common spaces. Another very important dimension, which I'll touch on briefly, places of worship and places where you can practice your culture. Multiculturalism doesn't mean you even everything else out and everyone becomes the same as each other. It means providing that space and giving respect to people of different faiths, but preserving common space in every neighborhood and in every school. And because of our mixed neighborhoods, we also plan for places of worship of the different faiths all around the island. In my own constituency, I've got a mosque and 2 churches. In many other constituencies, they've got Chinese temples together with churches or mosques. So it becomes normal. The sounds, the vibes, the physicality of a multicultural society is part of everyday life in Singapore. It becomes normal. The inconvenience sometimes, but the sense within you that there's something attractive about that society. It grows on you, and it develops over time. Because people get used to it, it becomes part and parcel of life. Most public housing apartment blocks have a void deck. The ground level is a void. It's an empty space, which can be used for everything. And on many nights, it's used for Chinese funeral wakes, and sometimes on weekends, it'll be a Malay wedding. With all the joy and vibrance of a Malay wedding, and on the last day of the wake, the temple rites are performed, people can hear what's going on. And that becomes part of life. So providing the space for people to practice their cultures and keep their own faiths, but making sure it's taking place in neighborhoods and in schools where the common space is critical, where everyone is the same and equal, is extremely important. We're not perfect, we're still evolving, and we've got interesting opportunities ahead. And I'll highlight 2 very interesting opportunities coming out of the use of neighborhood spaces that are the opportunities of the future. The first has to do with skills. A quality school system alone, a quality system of universities and institutes of technical education and polytechnics alone is not enough for the future. We have to make lifelong learning and reinvestment in every individual through life the norm, because of the way technologies are evolving, the way jobs are evolving, both predictably and unpredictably. And that's our most important economic and social policy for the future. We call it skills future. But it can't just be a top-down matter. It's not just what your employer decides, and on-the-job training and a formal course you go to in some educational institution. It's got to be individually driven as well. And it's got to start with the individual who's working during the day, has a family to spend time with. Usually you're a bit tired after work, or during weekends you want to relax. It's got to be convenient, it's got to be attractive. And having that learning facility in the neighborhood using our community clubs and other community facilities is going to be a real opportunity. Making it easy, breaking the inertia. No matter where you start, you can start learning something in the community, something which you find helpful to your job or something to develop yourself. In case there's a job further down the road you might be interested in, or in case you develop a hobby that you end up taking very seriously. So continuous learning and lifelong learning also has a spatial dimension to it. And neighborhoods play an extremely important role, easily accessible learning. Second challenge and opportunity is for an older society. And one of the challenges of healthcare all over the world is to bring healthcare closer to the home or bring it into the home. It makes a lot of economic sense because concentrating healthcare delivery in hospitals, and particularly acute hospitals, is the most expensive way to go about it and not the most pleasant way of being treated and cared for. Having something close to the home where your family member takes you down in the morning, or you can walk there yourself, and being able to be cared for at home using telemedicine and having a nurse or an allied health professional visit you from time to time at home becomes critical. So there again, community facilities in the neighborhood become critical. And as our society becomes older, this is a real opportunity to raise the quality of life in the golden years so that people are not just living longer, but they're having meaningful lives with humane and affordable treatment and a sense that they're not being dislodged from the home or the family. That too is something we're taking very seriously. Nursing homes, community care facilities, daycare and rehabilitation, and home nursing. Very important direction for the future. Let me conclude, I'm just about on time, by making a couple of broader points which have to do with social and economic policy making, which have to do with individual choice, market forces, and the role of public policy. We now understand better from experiences around the world and over the course of over the decades, we understand the invisible hand of the market better. It's a powerful force, largely for the good in most societies. But an unregulated market leaves significant social costs that don't diminish automatically over time, and they're also extremely inefficient in economic terms, as we know from the global financial crisis. The consensus has shifted, and most people who are not crazy know that we've got to regulate markets. That's the economic market. But what about the social market? What about society? We also know, and we don't need reminding, that societies don't naturally trend towards some equilibrium. They don't naturally trend towards harmony, particularly ethnic and religious accommodation and a deepening of that spirit of harmony. It's not a natural tendency in society. It's not part of the natural workings of society that you get people wanting more and more to live with people who are different from them. And there's, unlike financial markets, which finally revert to the mean and come back to some equilibrium after a tortuous path and after creating great damage sometimes, in society, there's no reason to expect a reversion to the mean, because social forces, just as easily, and from what we've seen, do perpetuate themselves. And you move further and further away from the center towards the extremes. Polarizing forces are part and parcel of an unregulated society. So we need the visible hand of public policy to mitigate the invisible hand of the market, both the economic market as well as the invisible hand of social forces. We need that visible hand. And the real issue is how you go about it. Do you do it upstream, which is our preference? Do you intervene upstream, put in place the guardrails, put in place the rules, put in place the incentives, make it attractive for people to live together and keep working at it? Or do you wait for things to happen on their own cause and intervene downstream where you're forced to, and often in a very heavy-handed way, And do you wait for social costs to build up downstream? That's the real question. So we should avoid the easy intellectual bifurcation where people accept that you've got to intervene in the economic market to redistribute, to make sure that there's some inclusivity at work, but sort of feel a bit uneasy when it comes to social interventions. It looks like social engineering, but that's actually a superficial concept. You either do something upstream that's meaningful, provides the right incentives, or you deal with the problems downstream, which are typically more costly to individuals as well as to the public purse. And it's not just a financial matter, obviously. It's about legacies that are very hard to undo. The legacies that come about when society becomes more divided, particularly along ethnic and religious lines, are very hard to undo. So that's the real choice. Do you do it upstream or do you do it downstream? And it means not veering from one extreme to another, not trying to intervene in everything you think you can do better than individuals and families do by their own choices. And we have to remember that, economic policy is an inexact science, but social policy is even less predictable and has unintended effects that keep surprising us. So there's no predictability in this, but we've got to do something and not pretend that the natural workings of society lead us to a better place. And that means having some forms of nudging, putting in place guardrails, putting in place buffers, providing incentives for people to interact with each other, engage with each other, live together, go to school together. You need some soft forms of encouragement, incentive, and sometimes some rules that constrain choice in order to avoid a situation where choice is taken away from people downstream because opportunities get diminished. That's really the nub of it all. And learning from each other on which forms of nudging and incentives work better, although in very different contexts, obviously, is what we have to do. Keep an open mind, but know that we can't just leave it to the market, and you can't just leave it to society. We've got to do all we can in ways that people find acceptable and attractive to keep society fluid, to ensure that disadvantage doesn't pass from one generation to the next, to ensure that multiculturalism is a source of pride for citizens, and to ensure that society is at peace with itself. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Prime Minister. Really excellent comments. I think will stimulate some really great discussion. So I'll invite the respondents to come to the panel here. So I'll introduce them as they come forward. Marguerite Turner is a Senior Vice President at Urban Institute, a national expert on urban planning and communities, was formerly a senior administrator at the Office of Housing and Urban Development. So YC Wong is the head of the Department of Architecture at National University of Singapore. I'm pleased to say he's also an undergraduate degree from Washington University in St. Louis. And YC's early experience was studying the Pruitt-Igoe project in St. Louis, which is the exemplar of failed public housing in America, and has affected his views about housing and architecture for low-income communities. And David Connor is the recently retired Chief Executive Officer of OCBC Bank, Overseas Chinese Bank Corporation in Singapore. David was in Singapore in that role for about 15 years, and previous to that, working in banking in other countries in Asia, has recently returned to David is also an undergraduate from Washington University in St. Louis. I didn't realize we had our own people on the panel here, but we do. But they will all have very independent views and particular views, and we have quite a mixture here for respondents, and so we'll start off with Marguerite. And
thanks very much. Thanks for the invitation to be here today. It's really been fascinating and inspiring to learn about the principles and the tools at work in Singapore. So I'm going to give a bit of a U.S. perspective as a starting point for the conversation of the day. Earlier this year, the economist Raj Chetty released new research that really shook up the U.S. Conversation about place and economic opportunity, about place and economic mobility. His findings extend and reinforce a substantial body of existing research on the importance of where we live, where our housing is located. They convincingly show that every year of exposure to a more opportunity-rich community improves a child's chances of economic success as an adult. And we also know from other research, including research by Pat Sharkey, that some of the effects of living in a distressed community extend across generations. So this is an issue of long-term economic advancement and opportunity. Now, some people are using this new evidence to rehash a very tired debate about people-based policies versus place-based policies. But I've been arguing for some time that we need to get past that dichotomy, that we really need to pursue place-conscious strategies for helping low-income families gain access to opportunity and to share in our country's prosperity. So this argument is based on some key facts from our recent history, a history that's quite different from Singapore's. So over many decades, both public policies and private market practices in the United States have explicitly built neighborhoods of poverty and distress. By simultaneously excluding poor families, especially families of color, from neighborhoods of opportunity, and disinvesting in the neighborhoods where poor people, particularly people of color, were clustered. So reversing that legacy, I think, requires combination strategies that address both the disinvestment and distress plaguing poor neighborhoods and the barriers that exclude low-income people from neighborhoods of opportunity. So these are strategies that advance both revitalization and inclusion. So I think that means doing 4 things at the same time and for a long time. This doesn't change overnight. The first is investing in the most urgent needs of poor neighborhoods. Safety, good schools, healthy places to play, and access to jobs. So kids growing up in those neighborhoods can get a foothold on the ladder toward economic success. Now, sometimes that's going to mean linking the residents of poor neighborhoods to assets in other neighborhoods, in effect making where they live matter somewhat less. The second key element is that when those investments in poor neighborhoods start to pay off and those neighborhoods begin to attract higher income residents, we need to ensure that the neighborhood's original residents and people like them can afford to stay, can have continued access in those neighborhoods by explicitly preserving affordable housing before the market takes off and minimizing displacement. Third element is eliminating the barriers that block poor families, especially families of color, from finding affordable places to live in other neighborhoods of their choice. And that means building or explicitly acquiring low and moderately priced housing in every neighborhood, city and suburban. And finally, fourth, helping poor families who want to move to safe neighborhoods with good schools and other opportunity-enhancing amenities, using tools like the housing voucher program, along with landlord outreach, mobility counseling, and really explicit search assistance. Now, advocates who are committed to one side or the other of that old people versus place debate sometimes suggest that it's naive of me to argue for this kind of combination strategy, that resources are limited and we have to choose, or if they are economists, they may say, I have to decide what's the best use of the marginal dollar of public investment. But I really think that the evidence teaches us that the goals of neighborhood inclusion and neighborhood revitalization have to be viewed as interdependent, not competing. Neither can be fully realized if the other is neglected. So to give an example of that, I think when residents of an opportunity-rich, privileged neighborhood perceive that the places where poor people of color live suffer from severe distress, their fears and prejudices are reinforced, and it is much harder to achieve the goals of mobility and inclusion. Similarly, when affordable rental housing remains concentrated in lower income sections of central cities and exclusionary zoning barriers remain unchanged in suburban jurisdictions, a neighborhood revitalization strategy is going to find very few options for where to build replacement housing, where to relocate the original residents of distressed properties. And if that revitalization effort takes off and triggers renewed market demand, you'll see an inflow of higher income people resulting in increases in property values and rents that leave the lower income residents with very few choices about where to live, and in some cases may just lead to the reconcentration of poverty in another nearby neighborhood. So again, these are interconnected, interdependent goals, not competing objectives. Now often, I think the perceived conflict between mobility or inclusion strategies and neighborhood revitalization initiatives stems from the fact that in the US, we typically assess these investments one initiative at a time, rather than thinking about portfolios of investments that achieve strategic goals. So if you think from the perspective of a local policymaker who has to decide where the next $1 million is going to be spent, then indeed there may be a conflict between launching an assisted mobility program, preserving affordable housing in a gentrifying neighborhood, or building mixed income in a distressed neighborhood. One strategy is, in fact, going to have to win out for that next $1 million. But if you could incentivize a more deliberate citywide planning process, more proactive, allocating perhaps $5 million over a couple of years to tackle concentrated poverty, segregation, neighborhood distress, you would certainly decide all three of those initiatives are part of the portfolio and invest in all of them. So it's really critical in the US that federal policies incentivize this kind of citywide, or better yet, region-wide planning and decision-making, and help build the capacity locally to carry it out. So I'm encouraged that in recent months, the American public, many in the media, and pretty much all the presidential candidates have expressed dismay about growing inequality in the US and barriers to upward mobility. Persistent poverty and inequality, we know, are extremely complex problems. They're daunting challenges, and they're going to require a sustained attack across multiple domains and at multiple levels of government. I would not argue that the kind of place-conscious strategies I've been talking about provide the whole solution. But I think they have a really essential role to play, and they've been left out of this conversation for too long. Given the really compelling evidence that residential segregation, poverty concentration, and neighborhood distress exacerbate inequality and block economic mobility, we really can't build toward a future of shared prosperity and opportunity if we fail to tackle the intersection of poverty, place, and race in our country. With strategies that tackle both the disinvestment and distress that currently plague poor neighborhoods and the barriers that are excluding low-income people, and especially people of color, from neighborhoods of opportunity. For me today, hearing about how Singapore is tackling these issues really fuels my optimism that the US could overcome the legacy of our past policies and market forces and build a next generation of neighborhoods that are really opportunity enhancing and inclusive. So, thanks.
We'll give the Deputy Prime Minister an opportunity to respond to brief comments to the respondents, and then when we've gone through all three, we'll open up to the audience.
Shall we do them together?
As you would like.
I think that's better.
Okay, good. So we'll turn to Y.C. Wong.
Mr. Tamaran, I think it's quite wonderful to hear you in person, talking very thoroughly about how the everyday and the quotidian basically defines the politics in Singapore, and the accessibility, particularly of housing, of amenities, prefigures very significantly in the construction of our society. I think in the recent symposium, you talk about what we have in Singapore is likened more to a trampoline than to a safety net. And I want to maybe work on that metaphor a little bit more and try to get at some maybe of the challenges that might test really the strength of that trampoline. I think that the two things that I think that comes foremost in my mind, and as an educator in architecture, these always appear very strongly. Number one is, I think through your presentation, I think the audience get a very clear idea that in Singapore, as you say, much of the policies are intrusive, top-down, and working forward, whether in the near future, and I think you also have heightened this as one of the concerns, how do we take things out to create more resilience in our community? Particularly if we look at all the new towns that are developed in Singapore, I think most of you who are fans of how we develop new towns in Singapore will know that they're primarily based on nucleated families. I think the changing demography would have tremendous impact. And I'd just like to hear your view on how we are preparing ourselves for this transformation in the the demographic landscapes. I think in part you have alluded to the aging population, but there are others, of course, which include new people coming in, people who have chosen not to have families but stay alone, and so on and so forth. And I really do believe that way forward is indeed the development of skills in place and seeing this kind of social experiments that respond to the needs, producing perhaps new kind of industries and new kind of innovations that will move Singapore forward. So that's one part, the demographic transformation and the preparation and the resilience of the new town models to these changes. I think the second one, I think, is perhaps more difficult. I think it's an ideological one. Here I'm talking about personal politics that is extremely difficult. I remember my son going to SGI, and I found out actually he was not in the top class in his school, and asked him, hey, you know, why are you not in the top class? You are generally very good. I mean, he came out with the top 10 percentile, but he was still not in the best class. And I found out that the best class at SGI was Vietnamese students, Indonesian students, and others. And his remark, I think, in a very knowing way, I think more to spike me was, oh, because they are hungry, I'm not. Pretty much talks about the issue forward for generations of, I think, Singaporeans who somehow are assured that there are the safety net in place and they don't need to try as hard as they should. I am not saying that my son is symptomatic of this generation, but I suspect that it is quite pervasive. And I do see these issues raised also in schools, where because of the habituation of being told what to do, the difficulties of actually breaking out remains, I think, a big issue. So cascading this to our new towns, I mean, the question maybe is, how do we think more of some kind of ground up participation of communities in defining the conditions of the estates? I think most of our audience members here will not know that besides being very secure in your lift, that can be extricated in 15 minutes if you're trapped, you can be assured that all the housing have all the light bulbs, in the corridor lighted up every day. the grass are well cut, our garbage are removed on time. So the thing that we want to find out is how can we create new typologies of new town, where indeed the infrastructural part are provided by the state, but more of the life of every day is created by local people. The occupation of public spaces, for example. I mean, the minister showed us a very beautiful picture of the common spaces that are used. I think long term, maybe we're thinking of how do we empower, engage communities actually to take care of those landscapes, so that if you talk about resilient maintenance on landscape, this would provide that kind of outlet. So that's a question. The question is really how to really maybe tweak the model of delivery of all these services and relegate this or delegate this to more community ground-up conditions. I think addressing these two components, I mean, maybe to get a sense of whether these are indeed the primary changes for the future landscapes of Singapore.
Okay, good. Thank you very much, Professor Wong. So David Connor.
Thank you, Michael. In the interest of full disclosure, I think it's important for me to relate the fact that I'm a long-term observer and a huge admirer of Singapore and Singapore's policies and successes. Started in 1985 when I moved to Brunei to head up Citibank's operations there, and my boss was in Singapore, which is pretty close by. And so I traveled to Singapore quite a few times before then moving there to head up Citibank's operations in 1991, 6 years, and then coming back to be engaged with the OCBC Bank. So I've often said that Singapore is a wonderful place. They are effective planners. They are very diligent in execution, and when they do make mistakes, which is rare, they're quick to adjust and improve and get back on track to run a very efficient country indeed. So I'm a huge fan, and reflecting on how then could I contribute to this conversation, I thought, well, the best way would be to relate OCBC's experience in financing Housing Development Board flats. You'll go back to 2003. We were struggling for top-line growth in the bank. We had gone through a period of the post-dot-com bust in 2001, SARS in 2003, which caused economic difficulties. And the government then announced that they were going to allow the private sector, the banks, private banks, to finance secondary purchases of Housing Development Board flats. Now, when I say secondary, primary purchases were still going to be financed, and to this day, as far as I know, are still financed by the HDB itself. So we saw this change as a significant opportunity, and we had, in fact, been reflecting on the fact that when there are significant changes in the marketplace, those changes, disruptions, whatever, signal an opportunity to take significant market share. And so I challenged the OCBC team to take 50% of the, no less than 50% of the new secondary purchase market to finance mortgages for Housing Development Board flats. And our team did a fantastic job. They reorganized, they expanded the branch that we had that was in the HDB center so that we could take applications efficiently. We re-engineered, so to speak, our processes so that we would be quick in terms of responses for approvals and processing the necessary documentation and so on and so forth. And when the market opened, we quickly took 50% market share, which was very satisfying. And we thought, how could we go wrong financing Housing Development Board flats? Clearly, this is rice bowl housing, bread and butter housing, whatever you want to call it. People, want to retain their homes, so they pay their bills. We were intentionally absolutely colorblind. We didn't look to any ethnic group, and we financed any and all flat, including the three-bedroom flats or the three-room flats that Deputy Prime Minister mentioned. So we had a building and a rapidly growing portfolio, which we thought was quite attractive. And then 6-9 months later, we started to realize we had some problems. There were certain ethnic groups, not to be mentioned, but and the lower income flats where people simply didn't pay. And so we had a fairly sizable problem mortgage portfolio, which was a big surprise to us. You could argue we should have had better data on who pays and who doesn't pay. The reality in Singapore was that there is a credit bureau, and the credit bureau existed in those days, and basically the banks would share through the credit bureau information on problem people who got overextended with debt or whatever. But that was limited to a fairly high income segment of society, because the banks in Singapore to this day, as far as I know, are still not allowed to give unsecured credit to anyone that makes less than 30,000 Singapore dollars a year, which is roughly 23,000 US dollars in today's exchange rate. So the banks were not allowed to do lower income unsecured credit, so we had no information base on that segment of society. Of course, HDB had the information, but they weren't sharing it. The power companies had the information, the utility providers had the information, but again, that wasn't being shared through the credit bureau. So we had a problem portfolio, and that meant that we had to foreclose on quite a sizable number of flats and move people out. We realized that this is, again, public housing, and that we had to be extremely careful in foreclosing on these properties. And so we worked closely with the Housing Development Board to help people move from the flats that they weren't paying for into either rental properties or whatever. It took a very long time, if you will. Normally, we would foreclose on a mortgage fairly quickly in Singapore. The courts are efficient. The system works very well. But we clearly were dealing with housing that was HDB housing, and we had to be very careful. So we worked with the HDB. They were very cooperative in dealing with the problem portfolio, and we worked through the difficulties and adjusted then our underwriting, our approval standards, so that we wouldn't get more of these problem loans. The lesson, I think, is very clear. That one, a public and private partnership can work, and it can be quite effective. This, of course, took a burden of financing away from the government of Singapore and moved it to the private sector. The fact that we were conscious, and we were actually at one point accused of causing political problems, because many of these people who couldn't pay and we had to foreclose on were actually going to their members of parliament and complaining that big bad OCBC was treating them badly. Again, we took much more time than we normally would to foreclose on these properties. We cleaned up the portfolio. It is a very solid portfolio today in OCBC, and has been a great source of financing for us. But I think it's quite clear that there will always be some people in society who either can't or won't pay their bills. Now, in the situation of Singapore with HDB housing, typically, as Deputy Prime Minister mentioned, as Tharman mentioned, the servicing of mortgages in HDB is usually from the Central Provident Fund contributions that both the employee and employer make to the Social Security Fund, which is called the Central Provident Fund. And therefore, there shouldn't be a problem, but there was a problem with some of these loans. And I think that it's a very interesting reality that there are some people in society who simply can't deal with their debt, or they don't want to, whatever. And the reality is that the government of Singapore still handles these cases with compassion and with care, because there is a moral hazard. If you're selling these flats at subsidized rates to begin with, you're contributing quite significantly to the wealth of each and every individual who purchases them. And at the same time, you need to support some of the people who fall out of the system. The government of Singapore does that very well, in my opinion, without necessarily signaling to more and more people that they don't have to pay and they'll still be taken care of. and it is effective. But perhaps, Darman, maybe you'd want to reflect a little bit on how you deal with those problems. As I say, from my vantage point, the conclusion is a public and private partnership can work very well, does work very well today, but we made our mistakes and learned our lessons therefrom. Thank you very much.
Okay, really terrific responses and questions for the table. So we'll first let the Deputy Prime Minister respond.
Thanks, Michael. Well, three very thoughtful sets of points, and from quite different perspectives. I'll take it in reverse, not in order of difficulty. First, I think starting with David's points, it was a very important lesson we all learned, the criticality of credit assessments. The problem with the US subprime crisis, as we know, although it was magnified by securitization and magnified by the slicing and dicing of products and distributing them all over the world, the problem was at its heart a relatively simple one. The weakening of standards of credit assessment at the time that a loan is given. And in many instances, the absence of a credit assessment process altogether. It's something which we've learned because we started off our own public housing loan scheme without much credit assessment. Everything was going up in those days. Home price appreciation sort of came with income growth and GDP growth. And everyone's incomes were going up and they were able to afford their loans. Now, obviously that was too simple. There were some people who went for an apartment that was larger and more expensive than they could pay for over time, or something happened in their jobs. They fell into bad straits. So we've now been much stricter on credit assessment, and particularly in the last decade, not just the banks having to sort of improve the way they went about it, but even as far as the Housing Development Board itself is concerned, we've introduced stringent credit assessment. Everyone can afford a home because we're developing homes that are sized to everyone's needs. The two-room homes I spoke about, which give the lower income group the chance to own a home, and a decent-sized home by international standards for that income group. If someone wants to buy a much larger home in the hope that their incomes will go up over time, we'll ask them to think again, and there's a limit to how much of a loan we're willing to give. So there has to be a fairly stringent credit assessment at the time someone is buying their first home. That's critical to our whole process now. That's the other side of the coin from wealth appreciation. I had shown a slide earlier about how home prices have gone up over time for every category of housing. And in fact, the lower income group has seen a larger appreciation in home prices compared to not just those with larger flats, but even private property over the last 35 years. But the other side of the coin is that if you want to keep that up, there has to be stringent credit assessment so that people are able to pay down their loan over time and they don't run into great difficulty and have to sell it at a loss on the open market. So that's an important point. And I just want to say in that connection that the policies I described, the design of neighborhoods so as to ensure social mixing by income group and ethnic group, the provision of quality public spaces, have given us something free. It has given us a bonus. It has given us home equity appreciation for the lower income group that would not have been possible if they were living in a conurbation by themselves, or in an enclave by themselves, or a neighborhood by themselves. That's the big difference. We've got something for free. By designing neighborhoods so that they're mixed neighborhoods with quality spaces and attractive for everyone to live in, everyone's home equity goes up. And that's a little bit of a rarity. It's a little bit of a rarity around the world. We've got that for free, not by artificially fixing the prices on the open market, which we can't, not by a continuous stream of public subsidy, but by upstream design. By putting everyone together, every neighborhood is a mixed neighborhood. We have disadvantaged persons. We have disadvantaged families. We have at-risk youth. But we don't have a single disadvantaged neighborhood in Singapore, and we don't have a single at-risk neighborhood. That's the difference. We have disadvantaged families, but no disadvantaged neighborhoods. That's the social dimension of it. But there's an economic benefit, which we've got for free. Everyone's home equity has gone up over time. How sizable is it? If you look today at a retired couple, say recently retired in their mid-60s, and they're living in our smaller public housing apartments, the 3-room flat, which is quite typical for that socioeconomic group. And this is real data, those who are retiring today at age 65, they would have accumulated in that 3-room flat home equity of about 350,000 Singapore dollars by the time they retire. They bought the home in their late 20s or early 30s, retire at 65. They would have accumulated 350,000 of home equity. In other words, they paid down their loan and they're left with this equity in the home. That's about 260,000 US dollars. How much is that in terms of, as a percentage of their pre-retirement income? Because when you think of retirement adequacy, you're thinking of some sort of replacement ratio based on your previous incomes. And in retirement, you typically need less, so you don't need 100% of your pre-retirement income. The home equity alone, if monetized, is equivalent to about 40% of the pre-retirement income of that low-income couple, a couple that's around the 20th percentile of the income ladder. So it's a very significant asset. And our real challenge in Singapore today is encouraging people to monetize it. And we've devised schemes to help them monetize it, with some public grants coming in to incentivize them. Selling back part of your lease to the government, to the Housing Development Board, making it easier for them to right-size. The kids have moved out, the grandkids visit on the weekend, but they like a smaller flat, free up some of the equity in their larger flats. So a whole range of schemes. It's still a challenge because people generally are quite keen to stay on in the homes they've lived in and hope to pass on the asset to their children. And it's fine if the children continue to support them. It's fine. That's a family decision that they make. But if in fact they need cash and they need more support, it makes eminent sense to get some of the value out of the home, even if you continue staying there. And there are ways of doing it. So that's a big challenge for the future, which leads me to Yun Chi's point. It's a very significant trend we are seeing in Singapore and many other Asian societies, the changing character of the family when it comes to where people stay. It started off with nuclear families being formed, so no longer 3 generations, but just 2 generations, parents and kids and grandparents somewhere else. We're now seeing a phenomenon of a growing number of elderly singles, not just couples staying somewhere not too far from the kids and the grandkids, but elderly singles, a growing proportion. And that's something we should do. We should do something about that to give them meaningful and satisfying lives. So we've introduced now a scheme to give an extra incentive for children to stay near their parents. It's a larger grant, essentially. But also, we need a way in which people who are staying alone have friends in the neighborhood and can themselves be active. And that leads me on to the other point which Chun Yi made, which is the scope for voluntarism and community action that's not just government-driven. Frankly, there's actually a fair bit of it taking place in Singapore that doesn't meet the eye. And the further away you are from Singapore, the less that this is obvious. There's a tremendous amount of voluntarism in Singapore that takes place every week, and it's growing. Not because the government says it's the right thing to do, but people are finding that they want to be useful. Retired people want to be active. They don't just want to be dependent on others to help them. They want to be out there helping others. We've got young kids getting involved in voluntary activity and then staying on and becoming youth leaders and eventually becoming community leaders. That's a very rich layer of society to be developed. We've got to develop that layer of society, and I agree entirely with Yun Chi. A resilient society is one where people feel responsible, not just for themselves and their families, which is fundamental, but they feel responsible for others, the people they live with, their neighbors, others in the community, or they feel responsible for a cause. And we have to develop that, develop civil society, but provide that space for people to do their own thing at the neighborhood level. And particularly in light of the challenges we all face, social mobility is going to require much earlier intervention in people's lives. And it's not just about institutionalized intervention through preschools and the like. It just requires good-hearted volunteers to be there interacting with a kid who doesn't speak the language at home, doesn't have the confidence to know that he or she can learn. It requires a lot of interaction by friendly souls. The other side of the spectrum, the elderly, that's going to require a lot of effort, not just by nurses and doctors and institutionalized medicine. It requires friends in the neighborhood. And we all know how emotional health matters so much to your physical health. So there are challenges that we face. We're going to have to do more as a government, but we also want to develop that rich layer, that rich vein in society that makes it a much better solution, a solution that people feel better about. I agree, you know, I have to be a little modest about commenting on Marjorie's presentation because I'm not immersed in the complexities of the situation you face in the US. But I must say, from what you said, I think you not only, you know, you have challenges, you have serious challenges in many American cities, but the directions which you're proposing seem to me to be a practical way forward. And I say that with some humility because I know how complex these things are. I would just emphasize one point which came out in my presentation as well. It can't be just about the rules and incentives. And there's some cities that are introducing very interesting tax incentives, for instance, to encourage developers to provide a range of housing across income groups. It must involve quality public spaces. It must be attractive for the middle class and the upper middle class to want to live in that neighborhood. And it must create a feeling of shared prosperity because everyone takes part in something that's really a very enjoyable part of their lives. A quality park, high quality playgrounds, new types of equipment for the elderly. Public spaces are important. They're a key public good and they're often neglected by planners. People must want to be there, not just because of the incentives or because you're forcing them to be there, and the developer is forced to provide a certain amount of low-cost housing. They've got to want to be there because it's a nice neighborhood to live in.
Okay, excellent respondents and responses from Mr. Tarman. So we'll turn it over to the audience. The woman in the back, raise her hand first. So, yeah, or in the far back. Yeah, I'm sorry, I don't know everyone's name.
Thank you. My name is Nandini Kutty. The Deputy Prime Minister talked about the high cost of reversing legacy. And in the United States, the legacy is not one of a naturally caused racial and ethnic segregation or a segregation caused by neglect of public policy, but in fact, it is a segregation caused by public policy, by things such as written underwriting standards of the Federal Housing Administration many decades ago, and practices in the real estate industry of explicit discrimination, and practices such as racially restrictive housing covenants. In addition to this legacy, we also have the political context of a complete lack of political will to support integration. And I'm going to quote here something that presidential candidate Jimmy Carter said in 1976 in a campaign that he actually won, an election that he won. And in his campaign, he said, "I see nothing wrong with ethnic purity being maintained. I would not force a racial integration of a neighborhood by government action." He later explained what he meant by saying, "What I say is that the government ought not to take as a major purpose the intrusion of alien groups into a neighborhood simply to establish their intrusion." So in this context, with this type of legacy and this type of a political climate, what chances do you see for the United States to actually achieve integration?
So I agree with you, Nandini, that the United States built our economic and racially segregated neighborhoods through public policy and through the behavior of market institutions, and that it has created a legacy that is extremely difficult to reverse. I also think in listening to the tools that are being applied in Singapore, you know, we're a federalized country. We lack a tradition of centralized planning and neighborhood design. And we completely lack any entitlement housing subsidy that closes the affordability gap. So I think there are a lot of reasons, and as you point out, we have a political culture that I think refers to efforts to overcome the legacy of the past, refers to those changes as social engineering and rejects them as unacceptable, not recognizing that we socially engineered ourselves into the current situation. So I think there are a lot of reasons to be pessimistic. I am at the moment optimistic, partly because I'm an optimistic person, but also because I really think the focus of national policy conversations on inequality and on barriers to economic mobility, and frankly, this new evidence that Raj Chetty has produced that has really shifted a lot of people's thinking about the role that neighborhoods and segregation play in inequality and blocking mobility. I think that those circumstances may create a moment to build upon, to begin to shift our public policies and our public conversation, so that 20 to 25 years from now, we look back and see this year as a year that we began building a next generation of neighborhoods instead of rebuilding the last generation of neighborhoods. But that's a very optimistic view, and it's going to take a tremendous amount of work and people willing to take political risks.
I think the next hand up was Derek Hamilton.
I guess one concern of the Raj Chetty research, and I haven't heard him say this himself, but the integration strategy seems to be focused on somehow developing the cultural affect of a certain community so that they can develop better by integrating them into spaces with people that are more responsible, personal responsible. So I think I find the Singapore example a nice contrast because the emphasis seems to be on asset development, both public and private asset, in providing the parks as well as providing people with wealth, literal wealth by ownership. So I guess a question, that was a comment, but a question would be, if you ignore the fact that we spend so much on military, I guess that's hard to ignore, are we just not spending correctly in our approach? I like the metaphor of an upstream versus downstream approach. So could we end up with a more efficient, equitable outcome if we took what we were doing and did it in a more efficient way by focusing on upstream as opposed to downstream policy and asset as opposed to subsistence?
Well, if I could take the liberty of replying, I think you're right. You either engage in social interventions, and if you like, social engineering, by design, as intelligently as you can, and with the best public purposes in mind, or you engage in social interventions and engineering by default. And typically, if you do it by default, once problems have accumulated, first, the problems are larger, they're more intractable, and they're more expensive.
Any other comments on that? Okay, good.
Yes, good morning. Thank you very much. In macro urban areas like this one that we live in, a measure of income inequality at schools is often percentage of children on a free lunch program. And you have some schools where there's 0 and some schools where there's 70 or 80%. And school districts who feel that making the schools equal is sufficient as opposed to more diverse. So my question to the panel in light of the next panel is, is equal ever the appropriate goal, even if they're separate? Do you understand the question? Is equal enough if...
Well, I grew up on the principle that separate is inherently unequal. But here I would come back to my both-and approach. My argument would be that we need to invest in the schools that are currently serving lots of poor kids and make those schools absolutely as effective as we possibly can. I'm tantalized by this notion of moving the strong principles around as opposed to sort of allowing the strongest capacity to cluster in the most privileged schools. But I think if all we do is try to invest to equalize the quality of schools, we'll fail in our ultimate goal. And this is why, to me, creating more opportunities for income mixing, both by revitalizing neighborhoods so that they're attractive to a greater diversity of families, and opening up neighborhoods that have great schools and have excluded lower income people. That needs to be part of the answer too. And a third part of the solution can be sort of breaking this iron link between where a family lives and where their kids go to school. And getting that right so that every kid has a real shot at attending the school that's a good fit for him or her. Getting that right isn't easy or automatic, but those are the approaches I'd take. Again, a mixed strategy.
My name is Carl Mossfeldt. I work on these issues in the context of Sweden, and I was pleased to listen to the Deputy Prime Minister where he spoke about, reminded me about how we've dealt with these issues for a long time. We've spoken about it. We have generally been fairly successful in some of these contexts, but we have a new issue now, which I wonder how you think about, which is that Sweden in the last 2 months received the equivalent of 1% of our population in refugees from Syria. And that's added to what we received in the rest of the year. So we're looking at long term, I mean, adding a couple of percentages a year in new population coming to Sweden from a very distinct ethnic and social group. And it's raised a debate in Sweden whether there is a tension in terms of what you take on and what you can sustain. So in your ambition to drive social integration, do you also perceive a limit in terms of what stability that requires you to have, if you see my point?
Well, first, I think there's something noble about Swedish society in the way it accepts people who are fleeing from misery and trouble. And the Swedes are taking in a larger proportion of refugees than any other European nation. For this to work, and I say this with the disadvantage of distance, for this to work, two things are critical: schools and jobs, quite apart from everything else we're talking about, which is about neighborhoods and place. And I'm aware of significant concentrations in Sweden, Malmö and some other areas of immigrants, so there's still work to be done there. But Sweden went through a major experiment with the privatization of schools about 2 decades ago that hasn't worked out very well. It didn't have the benefits that were intended, and in fact, standards overall in schools, as measured within Sweden itself, have declined. The gaps between those who have it and those who don't, in terms of wealth and educated parents, have widened, because you're now choosing a school where most of the other people are your own type. So that hasn't worked out well in Sweden and has gone against the grain of an egalitarian ethos that Sweden had. And in my opinion, that's a key question for public policy. And I've spoken to senior Swedish policymakers and some very thoughtful observers who also feel that that's the issue that has to be addressed. You're not going to get social inclusion with a private school system. Second, jobs. The biggest contradiction in Europe in this whole situation, and I say this without any intention to criticize Europe, which has to be emphasized, is taking in refugees in a way that few other countries in the world are doing. But the real challenge is in reconciling an open attitude towards migration with closed labor markets. The problem of insiders versus outsiders in the European labor market is sharper than in any other advanced countries. In other words, the protection of those who already have a job against young people, minorities, and women. It's well known. I'm not saying something new. So to have a policy that's generous towards immigrants and those who are refugees especially, to have that work for your own society, it has to go hand in hand with an opening up of the labor market. And that's a big challenge in Europe. That's a big challenge. I believe steps can be taken, but there is currently a contradiction in public policy.
Okay, I've lost track here, so let's take this gentleman and then that gentleman. And,
Mr. Deputy Prime Minister, my name is Mark Sampanathan. My question is, Singapore has a very unique environment where the government is very closely intertwined with private investment, like Temasek Holdings and GIC. So government policy has in many ways private equity investment to back it up, to exercise its investment direction and reach out to the to social engineering. The U.S., on the other hand, has this chasm between government policy and access to the type of money that would be needed to exercise that investment. Can you share some of your thoughts on how the government may be able to help steer investment firms, like Carlyle Group, for example, to put some money in the direction of facilitating the development of affordable housing in this way?
Well, I'll have to clarify first that the government ownership of enterprise does not have a social mission. First, the GIC and Temasek, you mentioned the two sovereign wealth funds that we have. The GIC invests entirely overseas. Its mandate is to invest overseas. Temasek has got a significant stable of Singapore companies that are a matter of historical heritage. Government ownership of the economy is somewhere between 10 or 15% of the economy. Not overwhelming, because we have a very significant foreign stake in Singapore and a very significant private stake. But those are companies that have to be run on a commercial basis. They are listed companies, accountable to shareholders that are all over the world, and the few that are not listed are corporatized and run as if they were listed. The one thing that Temasek aims to do, differently from some private shareholders, is to take a long-term view, to build long-term value in these companies. But it's an economic objective and not a social one. We do not want to burden our sovereign wealth funds with a social mission, because that's used in many countries as an excuse for many things, not always positive or not always working out as intended. It's far better that the government gets a stream of returns from the sovereign wealth funds that then can be used in the budget. Social policies, investments in the future, used in a way that's subject to parliamentary debate and decided on by the government. That's a better strategy.
My name is Carlos Campbell. And I've spent the majority of my adult life trying to deal with some of the issues associated with housing. Let me give you some background, which I think is appropriate. When I came here in 1965, I was assigned to the Defense Intelligence Agency. I tried to get housing. I was turned down by about 39 places. I wrote a one-page letter in 1968, which resulted in getting the River House desegregated. It was 1,661 units. So people found out I was a bit of a hellraiser. Senator Mondale asked me to testify in front of his committee, which I did. So I was optimistic because we had a Fair Housing Act in 1968. I ended up working at the Department of Housing and Urban Development, and many years later I was the Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Economic Development in the Reagan administration. With all of this experience, today I've never been more pessimistic for this reason. In 1923, Le Corbusier said that building is at the root of social unrest. What I'm seeing today is the proliferation of dystopian communities with the breakdown in families, with a criminal injustice system that's incarcerated 2.4 million people. I do not think we've ever had a single U.S. president that was an advocate for integrated housing or for equitable economic models, if you will. Nothing but lip service. I believe, as an optimist, that Christopher Fry was right when he said, strange how we trust the powers that ruin and not the powers that bless. I think we'll have a turnaround, but it will not happen as a result of rational forces. It will happen as a result of irrational behavior and irrational conduct. And I think that's a terrible thing to say. But that gives me hope because people will only take so much. So my question, Mr. Prime Minister, is how do you transfer what appears to be a very successful social policy into an economic reality in the United States? And I will say this the last time, one of the biggest obstacles to progress in the United States in housing and urban development is the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development.
First of all, I'd like to say to Carlos that we are both residents of Reston, Virginia, and as a result, and Richard Merrick in the back, and that's one town 50 years ago that was planned for economic and social and racial inclusion. Robert E. Simon died about 2 months ago at 101, but I think it's an example of policy that had tremendous impact on human beings. My question has to do with people with disabilities. I'm on the board of the National Disabilities Institute, and people with disabilities are the most impoverished, disproportionately, the most segregated, disproportionately, the most unequal in our society. How is Singapore addressing the issues of people with disabilities in terms of inclusion and opportunity?
So let me say a few things, and I think Marjorie wants to add a more informed view. And I say that because I'm not immersed in the problems that you have, and I can only speak from a vantage point that is quite different from where you're starting off with. But I do follow the American literature, and I do follow your debate, and I will just say a couple of things. First, there's a tremendous amount of study, very good study, on why things go wrong, why kids fail, why you get a certain social pathology developing in some neighborhoods and not others, and that's extremely useful. I think we also need a lot more understanding as to why some things work. The resilient kids I had a slide on earlier on, and you have many examples in the United States of people who somehow rise out of difficulty and do something exceptional. And I think, quite apart from the fact that they might have some ability that no one noticed, it very often, from what I've read, has to do with family, peers, a teacher, someone who gave them a second chance when they were in high school. Individuals matter. And if we learn more about that, the techniques of school management, the way in which you keep kids occupied in something they enjoy rather than having to find something else they enjoy that's outside of the school. I think we can create a culture that is optimistic about how we should solve things. Because the pessimism comes out of the very real description that you've talked about. But in order to get that optimism, we must know that it's worked somewhere. It's actually worked somewhere with these families, this neighborhood, that set of schools. And when we know what's worked, it is a job of public policy, it's a job of those who are in politics to support what works and put more resources into it. Train up the people and help to scale things up. It'll take time, but I feel that's important. To get people to integrate, it cannot just be a mind, the redistributive mind, that I'm doing this in order to help someone else or another group. It's got to be because everyone feels that, look, we are going to become a better society as a result of this, and we're all going to be better off. And I think that spirit of optimism does exist in the US in many parts. And I myself, as an education minister, and even on every trip I make to the US, I make it a point to visit schools. I make it a point to visit schools every time I come to the US. And I find outstanding examples in the United States. The last one I visited was the Bronx Center for Science and Maths. Public school with some charter-like qualities about it, but a public school. Different ethos amongst its teachers. Different ethos amongst the students. Strict discipline, but empathy and a conviction that everyone can actually do much better than they thought they could.
Okay, we've run out of time. So as the person coordinating here, I just want to make one additional comment because I think it's relevant. I very much appreciate David Connor's comments about the importance of credit and the Deputy Prime Minister's response about the importance of credit and that not every family is going to be able to maintain a mortgage. I would like to add, though, that in Singapore there is, and there does need to be as good information on credit as possible, and then decisions have to be based on that. There will still be families who get into difficulty, and I know, because I'm a social worker, and I know what happens in the community in Singapore, extraordinary efforts are put into families that might need some assistance to maintaining that mortgage. So there is an additional social investment, I would call it, in stabilizing those households. So also important part of the picture. We're going to take a break now. Following the break, we have a very interesting panel on the role of government. I think you can see that that's a topic that's been teed up here very well, and we'll have that session before lunch. And the slides of the Deputy Prime Minister are printed out, and they're on the table in the back if you'd like to get them. Thank you very much. Really